The Shadow Collector, a Detective Sherman cold case investigation content warning. The following story contains descriptions of crime scenes, discussions of murder, and psychological manipulation that may be disturbing to some viewers. This content is intended for mature audiences 18 years and older. All names, locations, and identifying details have been changed to protect the privacy of those involved. This story is based on real events, but certain elements have been altered for privacy and narrative purposes. The opinions expressed are those of Detective Sherman and do not necessarily reflect the views of law enforcement agencies. Legal disclaimer: this content is provided for entertainment and educational purposes only. The events described herein are presented from the perspective of Detective Sherman and should not be considered a complete or official account of any investigation. Viewers should not attempt to investigate crimes or approach potential suspects based on information presented in this story. Introduction: I've spent 32 years looking into the darkness that people try to hide. The kind of darkness that leaves a stain on your soul long after you've closed a case file. My name is Detective Marcus Sherman, and I specialize in cases that others have given up on, the ones labeled cold and tucked away to gather dust in forgotten corners of precinct basements. But there's one case that still haunts me. One that follows me into my dreams and sits with me during quiet moments when my mind should be at peace. I call it the Shadow Collector. Every detective has that one case, the one that burrows under your skin like a parasite and feeds on your sanity. This is mine. It began on a Tuesday morning in November 2011, when the autumn chill had just begun to surrender to winter's grip in the small lakeside town of Millhaven. The kind of town where people leave their doors unlocked and everyone knows your business before you do. Or at least, that's what they tell themselves. But every town has its secrets, doesn't it? Have you ever wondered what secrets your neighbors might be keeping? What darkness might be living just across the street from you right now? I was called to the scene of what appeared to be a simple burglary gone wrong. Catherine Westmore, a 42-year-old librarian, had been found dead in her colonial-style home by her sister after failing to show up for their weekly lunch date. Initial reports suggested a break in shattered glass by the back door, drawers pulled open, a missing jewelry box. The responding officers had already written it off as a robbery with tragic consequences. But something felt wrong the moment I crossed the threshold. The air in that house felt heavy, like it was pressing against my skin. In my 3 decades of detective work, I've learned to trust that feeling, the one that crawls up your spine and whispers that what you're seeing isn't the whole story. You see, chaos has patterns. Even in the most disorganized crime scenes, there are threads of intention if you know how to look for them. And what I saw in Catherine Westmore's house wasn't random. It was choreographed, a performance staged for whoever would find it. I just didn't know then that it was only the opening act of a much larger, more terrifying show. A show that would lead me into the darkest corners of human psychology, challenge everything I thought I knew about criminal behavior, and ultimately force me to confront my own shadows. So settle in, lock your doors, and ask yourself, how well do you really know the people in your life? Because I'm about to tell you a story that might make you question everything. The investigation begins. The first thing that struck me about Catherine Westmore's home was what wasn't there. In my experience, burglars are opportunistic. They grab what they can see, what's easily accessible. But in Catherine's house, several valuable items were in plain sight. A silver tea set on the dining room table, an expensive laptop on the desk, even cash left in a jar labeled vacation fund in the kitchen. What kind of thief leaves cash behind? I asked Detective Laura Mitchell, my partner for this investigation. She was newer to homicide, only 5 years in, but she had sharp instincts. One who wasn't here for money, she replied, her eyes scanning the room methodically. The medical examiner, Dr. Visas 90. Patel was kneeling beside Catherine's body in the living room. She looked up as we approached. Single stab wound to the chest, precise angle through the fourth intercostal space directly into the heart. Death would have been quick, Maybe even instant, she explained, her gloved finger indicating the entry wound. Not a lot of blood spray, which suggests she was stabbed while lying down or immediately pushed down after the stabbing. I crouched beside the body, studying Catherine's face. Her eyes were closed, her expression almost peaceful. Not what you'd expect from a violent robbery gone wrong. Time of death? I asked. Based on liver temp and rigor, I'd estimate between 10 p.m. and midnight last night. I nodded, making mental notes. Any signs of defensive wounds? None that I can see. No skin under her fingernails, no bruising on her arms or hands. It's possible she knew her attacker and didn't see the attack coming. That detail lodged in my mind. No defensive wounds, no struggle. Catherine Westmore, by all accounts, a healthy, capable woman in her early 40s, had not fought back against her attacker. Have you ever wondered how you would react in such a situation? Would your survival instincts kick in, or would you be paralyzed by fear? It's a question we all hope we never have to answer. I moved through the house, letting my eyes absorb every detail. The kitchen was spotless except for a single mug in the sink, rinsed clean but not put away. In the study, books were arranged meticulously by category and then alphabetically. Catherine's bedroom was equally organized, clothes hung by color, shoes paired neatly in rows. But one room was different. The guest bedroom looked as though a small tornado had passed through it. Drawers upended, closet emptied, mattress askew on the bed frame. It was so at odds with the rest of the house that it felt like I'd stepped into a different building altogether. "This is where our thief did most of their searching," Laura said from the doorway. I shook my head. "No, this is where they wanted us to think they were searching. This is theater." I opened the closet door wider and examined the empty hangers. Notice anything strange? Laura stepped closer. There. All facing the same direction. Exactly. Who empties a closet in a panic but takes the time to put all the hangers back facing the same way? As we continued our examination, more inconsistencies emerged. The back door's glass had been broken from the inside. Not the outside tiny shards had fallen onto the back porch rather than into the house. The drawers in Catherine's jewelry box were all pulled out to exactly the same length, as if measured. And most telling of all, the alarm system had been disabled not by force or hacking, but with the correct code. Our killer knew the victim, I concluded, as we gathered in the kitchen. They knew her well enough to have her alarm code, and they constructed this entire scene to mislead us. But why go to such lengths? Laura asked. Why not make it look like a suicide or a natural death? I stared out the kitchen window at Catherine's meticulously maintained garden, because they wanted us to know it was murder. They just didn't want us to know who did it or why. What I didn't say aloud was the thought that was already taking root in my mind. This felt like the work of someone who enjoyed the process, someone who took pleasure in the deception, in the game of it all. 2 days later, my suspicions grew stronger. The autopsy revealed that Catherine had been sedated before she was killed. Trace amounts of a powerful sedative were found in her system. The stab wound was exact and deliberate, delivered with such precision that Dr. Patel suggested the killer might have medical knowledge. It's almost surgical, she told me over coffee in her office. They knew exactly where to place the blade for maximum efficiency. But the most disturbing discovery came from Catherine's computer. After breaking through her password protection, our tech specialist found that someone had accessed her personal journal just hours before her death. The entries had been read, but nothing was deleted or altered. They wanted to know her thoughts, I said to Laura as we drove back to the station. They weren't looking for valuables or secrets to exploit. They wanted to understand her inner life. That's intimate, Laura replied, a slight shiver in her voice. Exactly, and that's what worries me. This wasn't a crime of opportunity or even passion. It was calculated, personal, and executed with precision. Little did I know that Catherine's murder was just the first piece in a puzzle that would consume the next decade of my life. A puzzle where each new piece would be more disturbing than the last, and where the final image would be something I could never have imagined. Think about that next time you write down your private thoughts or share a secret with someone you trust. Because some predators collect more than physical trophies, they collect the shadows of who we really are. The pattern emerges. 3 months after Catherine Westmore's murder, another case landed on my desk that initially seemed unrelated. Martin Drainer, a 53-year-old high school history teacher, was found dead in his apartment by the building superintendent after neighbors complained about a persistent alarm clock that had been ringing for hours. The scene had been classified as a suicide. Martin was found hanging from a ceiling beam in his living room, an overturned chair beneath him. A handwritten note on the coffee table read, "I'm sorry for the pain I've caused. I can't live with myself anymore." It was clean, straightforward, and utterly wrong. I'd been called in because one of Martin's colleagues had raised concerns, insisting that suicide didn't fit with the man she'd known for 15 years. Martin wasn't depressed, she'd told the responding officers. He was making plans for summer vacation. He just bought season tickets to the symphony. I stood in Martin's living room studying the scene. Like Catherine's home, everything was neat, and organized books aligned perfectly on shelves, dishes cleaned and put away, not a speck of dust on any surface. But unlike Catherine's crime scene, there was no manufactured chaos here, no attempt to simulate a different type of crime. "What do you think, Shernan?" asked Detective Ramirez, who'd been assigned to the case before I was called in. I walked around the room slowly, taking in details. The note bothers me. It's vague the pain I've caused. What pain? To whom? Most suicide notes are specific, personal. They name people, explain reasons, give instructions about possessions or funeral arrangements. Maybe he wasn't thinking clearly, Ramirez suggested. Maybe. But look at the rest of the apartment. Everything is meticulously organized. This was not a disorganized mind. I moved to examine the chair that had supposedly been kicked away during the hanging. It was positioned at an odd angle, too far from where the body had been found, and the carpet beneath it showed no signs of having been recently disturbed, no drag marks, no impression from being kicked with force. But what truly caught my attention was Martin's home office. On his desk sat a leather-bound journal, open to the most recent entry, dated the day of his death. The handwriting was neat, the content mundane notes about an upcoming faculty meeting, a reminder to call his sister, thoughts about a book he was reading. "Did you read this?" I asked Ramirez. He shook his head, just noted that it was there. I carefully turned back through several pages, scanning the entries. It was when I reached an entry from 3 weeks prior that my blood ran cold. Had another dream about being watched. Woke up at 3 a.m., certain someone was in the apartment, but found nothing. Am I becoming paranoid? Dr. Lennox says it's just anxiety, but it feels more specific than that, like someone is studying me. I flipped through more pages, finding similar entries scattered throughout, found my desk chair at a different angle than I left it. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm certain I pushed it all the way in before leaving. Someone has been in my apartment. The books on my nightstand were rearranged. Not obviously, but I know how I left them. Mentioned my concerns to Rachel over coffee. She thinks I should install security cameras. Maybe she's right. I looked up from the journal. Were there any security cameras in the apartment? Ramirez shook his head. No, and no signs of forced entry either. Check with neighbors, see if anyone has cameras in the hallway, I instructed. And I want to know who this Dr. Lennox is and what he knows about Martin's state of mind. As I continued examining the scene, more inconsistencies emerged. There were no fibers from the rope on Martin's hands, which would be expected if he had tied the noose himself. The angle of the bruising on his neck didn't match a typical hanging. And most damning of all, talk screens later revealed the same sedative that had been found in Catherine Westmore's system. 2 days later, I sat across from Dr. Patricia Lennox in her office, a space designed to feel calming with its muted colors and soft lighting. Martin wasn't suicidal, Detective, she stated firmly. He was experiencing anxiety, yes, but it was situational, not clinical depression. He was concerned about what he perceived as intrusions into his private space. Did you believe him? I asked. Dr. Lennox hesitated. I thought his fears might have been exaggerated by anxiety, but I didn't dismiss them. I suggested he install security measures if it would help him feel safer. He seemed relieved by that validation. Did he ever mention feeling like someone was studying him rather than simply breaking in? Her eyes widened slightly. Yes, that was his specific concern. He felt like someone was observing him, learning his habits. How did you know that? I didn't answer her question. Instead, I asked, did Martin keep a journal as part of his therapy? Yes, I often recommend journaling to help patients process their thoughts. Martin was particularly diligent about it. The connection crystallized in my mind. Catherine Westmore had kept a detailed journal. Martin Drainer had kept a journal. Both journals had been accessed around the time of their deaths. Both victims had been sedated with the same drug. Both crime scenes had been carefully stagedoned to look like a burglary gone wrong, the other like a suicide. Someone was selecting victims who documented their inner lives, studying them intimately, and then staging their deaths to mislead investigators. The how and why remained elusive, but the who was beginning to take shape in my mind, a collector of sorts, someone who gathered people's private thoughts before taking their lives. I leaned forward. Dr. Lennox, I need to know if you have any other patients who've reported similar experiences, feelings of being watched or having their space invaded. She frowned. I couldn't share that information even if I had it, Detective. Doctor-patient confidentiality, I cut her off. We're dealing with a potential serial killer who targets people based on their private writings. If you have patients at risk, there are legal provisions for warning them. Dr. Lennox went very still. A serial killer? You can't be serious. I wish I wasn't. But right now, I need you to think very carefully about any patients who might fit this pattern. As I left Dr. Dashin/Passion's ear, Lennox's office, my phone rang. It was Laura. Shernan, we found security footage from Martin Drainer's building. 3 nights before his death, someone entered the building at 2 a.m. using a key fob, but we can't identify them. They kept their face angled away from the cameras. They knew where the cameras were, I said, unsurprised. Our killer studies their victims, learns their routines, their environments. There's more, Laura continued. We were able to trace the sedative found in both victims. It's a prescription drug called Zolvoltan, primarily used for patients with severe insomnia or for twilight sedation during minor medical procedures. Medical procedures, I repeated, remembering Dr. Patel's comment about the surgical precision of Catherine's stab wound. We need to look at people with medical training who might have access to this drug. Cross-reference with anyone connected to both victims. Already on it, Laura replied. But Shernan, I have a bad feeling about this one. So do I admitted, and I think we're just seeing the beginning. I was right. Over the next 6 months, 2 more bodies would be discovered. Each victim had kept a detailed journal. Each death had been staged differently: a car accident, a drowning, but the pattern was unmistakable to those of us looking for it. Someone was collecting people's most private thoughts and then collecting their lives. I began calling the killer the shadow collector in my own notes. Someone who gathered the darkest, most hidden parts of their victims before ending their lives. Someone who wanted to possess not just their final moments, but the essence of who they were. Have you ever considered what your journals, emails, or private messages might reveal about you? What story they might tell someone who is studying you like a specimen under glass? Because our shadow collector was doing exactly that, reading people's lives like books before deciding how their stories would end. The midpoint revelation. 8 months into the investigation, with 4 confirmed victims sharing the same signature elements, we hit a wall. Despite extensive forensic work, canvassing, and cross-referencing, we had no clear suspect. The killer left no DNA, no fingerprints, nothing to give us a physical identity. They were methodical to the point of invisibility. The task force had grown to include FBI profilers, digital forensic specialists, and detectives from neighboring jurisdictions. The case file had expanded to fill an entire cabinet. We had theories, timelines, psychological profiles, everything except the one thing we needed most: a name. It was during this period of frustration that I received a call from Laura late one night. "Shernan, I've been going through Catherine Westmore's case again, and I found something. It might be nothing, but..." "At this point, I'll take anything," I said, already reaching for my car keys. An hour later, I stood in the evidence room with Laura as she spread out photographs of Catherine's home on a large table. "Look at these bookshelves," she said, pointing to several images of Catherine's extensive library. I noticed something strange when I was reviewing the photos. Some books are slightly pulled forward compared to the others. At first, I thought it was random, but then I realized it's a pattern. She laid out close-up shots of the bookshelves. Indeed, certain books were pulled forward by about half an inch, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I made a list of all the titles, Laura continued, handing me a notepad. There are 17 books marked this way. I scanned the list, my exhaustion evaporating as I saw the pattern. These are all books about identity psychology texts, philosophical works on the nature of self, even novels that deal with characters struggling with who they are. Exactly. "And here's where it gets interesting," Laura said, pulling out another file. I went back and checked Martin Drainer's book collection. He had 14 books pulled forward in the same manner. My pulse quickened. The same titles? Some overlap, but not all. Martin's marked books included more historical works on identity studies of how people define themselves in different eras. "The killer marked these," I said, certainty filling me. They were signaling their interest, showing what attracted them to these specific victims. I checked with the other victims' families, Laura added. All of them reported finding books pulled slightly forward on shelves after the deaths, but they assumed it was from police searches, or just hadn't noticed before. This was our first real breakthrough behavioral signature that couldn't be explained away as coincidence. The shadow collector wasn't just studying their victims, they were leaving a subtle message about their motivations. "We need to catalog every marked book across all 4 victims," I said. There might be a pattern in the specific titles that could tell us more about our killer. For the next 2 days, we immersed ourselves in the victims' libraries, photographing and documenting every marked book. A clear theme emerged. All dealt with the nature of identity, the construction of self, the masks people wear, and the hidden aspects of personality. Many explored the idea that people are not single, unified selves, but collections of different personas depending on context. Our killer is obsessed with identity, I told the task force during our briefing. Not just with understanding it, but with possessing it. They select victims who document their inner lives extensively, study them intimately, and then take their lives, but not before marking books that reflect their own preoccupation with identity. So we're looking for someone with psychological or philosophical training? Asked Agent Rivera from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. Possibly. Or someone with a personal obsession with identity that extends beyond academic interest. The level of planning and the medical knowledge suggests someone educated, methodical, and patient. "What about connections between the victims?" Detective Chen asked. "There has to be some overlap in their social or professional circles." This had been our greatest challenge. On paper, the 4 victims shared no obvious connections. Different ages, occupations, social circles, even parts of the city. We'd spent months trying to find where their lives might have intersected. "Actually," Laura said, looking up from her tablet, "I think I found something. It's not a direct connection, but all 4 victims attended various events at the Blackwood Cultural Center over the past 2 years. The Blackwood Cultural Center was a hub for literary readings, art exhibitions, lectures, and workshops. It wasn't much of a connection. Thousands of people attended events there, but it was the first common thread we'd found. "What kinds of events did they attend?" I asked. Laura scrolled through her notes. Catherine Westmore attended poetry readings and a memoir writing workshop. Martin Drainer went to historical lectures and a photography exhibition. The other two victims attended various events, book club meetings, art openings, a lecture series on psychology and art. "We need a complete list of everyone who worked at or was frequently present at the Blackwood during that period," I said. "Staff, regular attendees, volunteer workers, everyone." The investigation shifted to the Blackwood Center, a converted Victorian mansion that had been a cultural fixture in the community for decades. We interviewed staff members, reviewed security footage, and combed through event registration lists. 3 days into this new direction, I sat in my office late at night, surrounded by files and coffee cups, when something caught my eye in a photo of a Blackwood Center event. It was a literary discussion featuring a local author, dated 6 months before the first murder. In the background, partially obscured but still recognizable, was Catherine Westmore, and 3 rows behind her sat Martin Drainer. I quickly pulled up photos from other events and began scanning the crowds more carefully. Within an hour, I had found photographs showing all 4 victims attending the same event, a lecture titled The Multiplicity of Self, Identity in the Modern Age, given by Dr. Sicety. Elias Montgomery, a visiting professor of psychology specializing in identity theory. My hand trembled slightly as I searched for information about Dr. Montgomery. His university profile described him as a pioneering researcher in the field of identity construction and narrative psychology, focusing on how individuals create and revise the stories of their lives. He had published several books on the subject and was currently on sabbatical to work on a new research project. I ran a background check and found nothing concerning no criminal record, no complaints filed against him. By all accounts, Dr. Blang. Montgomery was a respected academic with an impeccable reputation, but something about his research focus set off alarm bells. I called Laura despite the late hour. "I need everything you can find on Dr. Ress." Elias Montgomery. Journal articles, interviews, social media, and anything that might give us insight into his thinking. The psychology professor from the Blackwood lecture, you think he's connected? All 4 victims attended his lecture, and his area of expertise aligns perfectly with our killer's obsession. The next morning, bleary-eyed but energized by this new lead, I met with Laura and Agent Rivera to review what we'd found on Montgomery. His published work was primarily academic, exploring how people construct narratives about themselves and how these narratives shape their behavior and relationships. "Listen to this quote from his last published paper," Laura said, reading from her tablet. "The journal keeper is engaged in the most intimate form of self-creation, a conscious curation of experience, and thought that both reveals and constructs identity. In studying such private writings, we come closer to understanding the true multiplicity of self than through any other means. I felt a chill run down my spine. He's literally writing about studying people's journals to understand their true selves." "It's suspicious, but it's not evidence," Agent Rivera cautioned. "This is published academic work, not a confession." "What about his current research?" I asked. "He's on sabbatical. What exactly is he working on now?" Laura scrolled through her notes. According to his department, he's researching experiential identity theory, exploring how people's identities evolve through significant life experiences. The working title of his book is Final Narratives: How Endings Shape Identity. The 3 of us exchanged looks. "We need to talk to Dr. Montgomery," I said. "Not as a suspect, but as a consult on the case. Let's see how he reacts to the details of these murders." 2 days later, I sat across from Dr. Elias Montgomery in a small conference room at the precinct. He was in his mid-50s, tall and trim with silver-flecked dark hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His manner was composed and professional as he listened to our sanitized version of the case. "Fascinating," he said. when I finished outlining the pattern we'd discovered. This killer seems to be engaging in what I would call identity appropriation. They're not just taking lives, they're consuming the essence of who these people were. What do you mean by consuming? I asked, watching his expression carefully. Think of it this way, Detective, Montgomery explained, leaning forward slightly. Most of us exist across multiple plan-sore public selves, our private selves, the selves we reveal in intimate relationships. But our truest self might be the one we express when we believe no one is watching, when we're recording our thoughts in private journals or diaries. He paused, adjusting his glasses. Your killer wants to possess that most authentic version of their victims. By studying their private writings, they gain access to a self that perhaps no one else has ever fully known. There's an intimate violation there that goes beyond the physical act of murder. His analysis was unnervingly accurate, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was speaking from theoretical knowledge or something more direct. But there was nothing in his manner that suggested guilt or anxiety spoke with the detached interest of an academic discussing an abstract problem. Based on your expertise, I said, what kind of person would commit crimes like these? What would drive them? Montgomery considered the question. Someone profoundly alienated from their own sense of identity. Perhaps someone who feels they lack an authentic self and seeks to appropriate others' identities as a substitute. Or possibly someone who believes they're conducting a form of research exploring the nature of identity by studying how people respond to the ultimate threat. Research? Laura asked, her voice carefully neutral. Montgomery nodded. The academic term would be existential phenomenology, studying how human consciousness experiences extreme situations. Of course, he added with a small smile, most researchers use ethical methods, not murder. By the end of our interview, I was left with contradictory impressions. Montgomery's insights were helpful, and his analysis of the killer's psychology seemed accurate. Yet there was something in the precision of his understanding, the way he articulated the killer's possible motivations, that left me deeply unsettled. As he was leaving, Montgomery paused at the door. Detective Shernan, may I ask if the victims kept physical journals or digital ones? Both, I answered carefully. Why do you ask? Just professional curiosity. Physical journals tend to be more intimate, more revealing. People are more guarded in digital formats, aware on some level that their words might be more easily discovered. He smiled politely. I hope you find your killer, Detective. It's been fascinating speaking with you. After he left, Laura turned to me. What do you think? I shook my head slowly. He fits perfectly the knowledge, the interest in identity and journals, the connections to all the victims through the Blackwood Center. But there's no evidence, she finished. And he just voluntarily walked into a police station to discuss a murder case that he might be responsible for. Either he's innocent or he's supremely confident, I said. We need to dig deeper into his life. I want surveillance on him. And I want to know everything about his movements during the time of each murder. What we discovered over the next week both complicated and clarified our understanding of Dr. Montgomery. He had verifiable alibis for 2 of the 4 murders during Catherine Westmore's death. He had been at an academic conference in Boston with dozens of witnesses, and during the 3rd murder, he had been hospitalized for minor surgery. Yet his movements during the other 2 murders couldn't be confirmed. And as we dug into his personal life, we found troubling patterns. He lived alone in a meticulously organized apartment filled with books on psychology, philosophy, and identity theory. He kept detailed schedules and journals of his own. And most concerning, his psychological evaluation for a security clearance at a previous research position had noted unusual detachment and compartmentalized emotional responses. But what truly changed the direction of our investigation came from an unexpected source. A graduate student who had worked with Montgomery contacted us after seeing a news report about the case. Dr. Montgomery wasn't working alone on his research, she told us, nervously twisting her hands in the interview room. He had a research partner who wasn't officially acknowledged in his publications. someone he referred to as his methodological counterpart. Did you ever meet this person? I asked. She shook her head. No, but Dr. Montgomery would sometimes mention insights or ideas that came from this partner. He was very protective of their identity, said they preferred to remain anonymous because their methods were sometimes unorthodox. Did he ever give any indication of who this person might be? Laura pressed. The student hesitated, just once. He mentioned that his partner had a medical background and approached identity theory from a more experiential perspective than his academic one. Medical background, experiential approach. The pieces were slotting together, but not in the way we had expected. Montgomery might not be our killer, but he might be connected to them, perhaps even guiding or inspiring them. As we left the interview room, Laura looked at me with wide eyes. Are we looking at two people working together? A killer with medical training carrying out murders designed by Montgomery? Or Montgomery could be covering for someone, I countered. Creating alibis, providing theoretical framework, maybe even selecting victims based on who attends his lectures. The case had just become exponentially more complex. If there were indeed two people involved, one providing the intellectual framework, the other the medical expertise and physical action, we were dealing with a partnership of minds that made our shadow collector far more dangerous than we had initially believed. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a question began to form. What if Montgomery wasn't the dominant partner in this relationship? What if he was being used by someone else? Someone who understood how to manipulate even a brilliant psychologist. I stared at the caseboard, now covered with photos, timelines, and connections. At the center was a question mark where our killer's face should be. But now, that question mark might represent more than one person. Have you ever considered that the most dangerous predators might not work alone? That while you're watching one person, another might be watching you? Because, as we would soon discover, our shadow collector wasn't just a killer. They were a master manipulator who had created layers of deception that we were only beginning to unravel. And the most disturbing revelation was still to come. The unexpected twist. 2 days after our interview with Dr. Montgomery's former graduate student, we received an urgent call from the Millhaven Memorial Hospital. A nurse named Rebecca Collins had been found unconscious in a supply closet, a syringe containing traces of Zolvatinth, same sedative used on our victims, on the floor beside her. Rebecca survived, thanks to a janitor who discovered her quickly, but she remained unconscious for nearly 12 hours. When she finally woke, her story sent shockwaves through our investigation. Why? Rebecca survived her gwells. Why? Rebecca survived her. I've been receiving strange emails for months, she told us from her hospital bed, her voice still weak. Someone using different addresses, talking about identity and self-determination. At first, I thought they were spam or sent to the wrong person, but they became more personal, mentioning details about my life that weren't public. Did you report these emails? I asked. She looked down, embarrassed. No, I was. Intrigued, I guess. The messages were philosophical, thought-provoking. The sender seemed to understand things about me that even people close to me didn't notice. We developed a correspondence. Do you know who was sending them? They never identified themselves, just used the name Mnemosyne, the Greek goddess of memory. I assumed it was someone I knew playing some kind of intellectual game. Laura handed Rebecca a tablet displaying a photograph of Dr. Montgomery. Is this the person you were corresponding with? Rebecca studied the image and shook her head. I've never seen him before. I then showed her photographs of all 4 victims. She recognized Martin Drainer immediately. He was a patient here about a year ago. Minor outpatient procedure. I was his pre-op nurse. Further questioning revealed that Rebecca had also interacted with the 3rd victim during their spouse's hospital stay, and the 4th victim had been treated in the emergency room while Rebecca was on duty. What about Catherine Westmore? Laura asked. Any connection to her? Rebecca frowned in concentration. The name doesn't sound familiar, but I volunteer at the Blackwood Center's annual health fair. I might have met her there. The Blackwood Center connection again, but now with a hospital link as well. Rebecca herself kept a detailed journal, which she showed us. It contained not just daily events, but deep reflections on her experiences as a nurse, her thoughts about patients, and her philosophy of care. Yesterday, someone left a note in my locker, Rebecca continued. It said they wanted to meet, that they had something important to share with me. I thought it was from Mnemosyne. The note directed me to the supply closet on the east wing at the end of my shift. Her voice trembled. When I got there, someone grabbed me from behind. I felt a sharp pain in my neck, and then, nothing. Did you see who it was? I asked, though I already knew the answer. She shook her head. They came from behind. All I remember is the feeling of arms around me, holding me as I lost consciousness. It was almost gentle. The attempted murder of Rebecca Collins represented a significant escalation. First attack on a living victim rather than a carefully staged discovery of a body. It suggested our killer was becoming more bold, more urgent in their actions, or perhaps more desperate. We placed Rebecca under police protection and began tracking the IP addresses used to send the emails signed Mnemosyne. Most led to dead-end public libraries, coffee shops with free Wi-Fi, anonymized servers. But one address came back to a surprising location, a computer in the administrative offices of Millhaven Memorial Hospital. Hospital records showed that Dr. Ryaz B. Sess, Vanessa Keating, Chief of Psychiatric Services, had accessed that computer during the times several of the emails were sent. Keatinga, respected psychiatrist in her late 40s with extensive publications on trauma, identity, and memory. As we dug into her background, connections began to emerge. She had attended medical school with Dr. Plazin, Montgomery 20 years earlier. They had co-authored several papers during their early careers before apparently going their separate ways professionally. And most significantly, she had consulting privileges at the Blackwood Center, where she occasionally conducted workshops on narrative therapy and journaling as healing. She has the medical knowledge, the access to sedatives, and connections to all the victims through both the hospital and the Blackwood Center, Laura summarized as we prepared to bring Dr. Placefista's Keating in for questioning. And a long-standing relationship with Montgomery, I added. They could easily be the partnership we've been looking for. But when we arrived at Dr. Dodd, Keating's office to question her, we were met with a shocking development. Dr. Keating had been found dead in her home that morning, an apparent suicide. A note on her computer read simply, "I can no longer live with what we've done." The scene at her home was meticulous, too meticulous. Like our previous cases, it felt staged, artificial, and toxicology would later confirm that the same sedative had been used on her. She wasn't the killer, I said to Laura as we stood in Keating's immaculate living room. She was the next victim. But the emails came from her computer, Laura objected. And the suicide note confesses involvement. I shook my head. Someone wanted us to think she was involved. They used her computer to send those emails, probably framed her as an accomplice, and then killed her when we got too close. Montgomery? Let's find out. We arrived at Dr. Montgomery's apartment with a warrant, only to find it empty. Neighbors reported seeing him leave with a suitcase early that morning. A quick check confirmed he had purchased a one-way ticket to Switzerland, departing that afternoon. We apprehended Montgomery at the airport just minutes before his flight was scheduled to board. He appeared genuinely shocked when informed of Dr. Keating's death. "Vanessa is dead?" he repeated, his academic composure cracking for the first time. That's not possible. In the interrogation room, Montgomery initially maintained his innocence, claiming he was traveling for an academic conference. But as we presented the evidence's connection to Keating, to the victims, his mysterious research partner, his sudden departure, his demeanor changed. "You don't understand," he said, his voice low. "I'm not running from the law. I'm running for my life." "Explain," I demanded. Montgomery removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose wearily. "About 3 years ago, I began receiving letters from someone who had read my work on identity theory. Brilliant letters. They pushed my thinking in new directions, challenged my assumptions. We developed a correspondence that became the foundation for my current research. This person called themselves Mnemosyne," I stated rather than asked. He looked up, surprised. "Yes." "How did you?" "Continue. I never met them in person." "They insisted on anonymity, said they were conducting practical research on identity that complemented my theoretical work. I was intrigued by their insights, their understanding of how trauma and threat reshape the self." "Did you know this practical research involved murder?" Laura asked sharply. Montgomery's face drained of color. "No. God, no. Not until recently." He swallowed hard. "About 2 months ago, they sent me a journal. Catherine Westmore's journal said it was field data that would help my research. I recognized her name from the news reports about her murder. That's when I began to suspect something was very wrong. Why didn't you come to the police?" I demanded. "Because by then, I was already implicated," he said miserably. "Looking back, I can see how carefully they constructed everything, having me give lectures attended by the victims, using my theories to select targets, making sure there were connections that would lead back to me." "And Dr. Keating? What was her role?" Montgomery looked confused. "Vanessa? We're colleagues, friends from medical school. She wasn't involved in my research." "But the emails to Rebecca Collins came from her computer," Laura pointed out. Montgomery shook his head. "That wasn't Vanessa. Mnemosyne must have used her computer somehow. Vanessa and I had dinner last week, and she mentioned strange occurrences in her office files moved, her computer sometimes showing different programs than she remembered opening. A horrible suspicion began forming in my mind. This Mnemosyne, did they ever mention other people they were corresponding with? Other subjects?" "Yes," Montgomery said quietly. "They referenced parallel studies with other subjects. I assumed they meant other academics or researchers, or other potential victims," I said. "Dr. Montgomery, I need every communication you had with Mnemosyne. Every letter, email, note everything." As Montgomery cooperated with our investigation, a disturbing picture emerged. Mnemosyne had been playing an elaborate game, using Montgomery's academic work as a framework for selecting victims, while simultaneously setting him up to take the fall if the murders were connected. They had used Keating's computer to contact Rebecca Collins, creating another false lead. And now they had murdered Keating, making it appear that she and Montgomery were partners who had fallen out. It was a masterful manipulation, layers upon layers of misdirection designed to keep us chasing shadows while the real killer remained hidden. But the most chilling aspect was revealed in Montgomery's correspondence with Mnemosyne. The unknown person had described their work as an exploration of authentic identity under terminal pressure. They believed that people revealed their truest selves only when facing death, and that by studying their victims' journals before and during their final moments, they could map the transformation of self at the threshold of non-existence. "They're studying how people change when they know they're about to die," I explained to Laura as we reviewed the letters. "The journals provide the baseline identity, and then they watch how that identity transforms in the face of death. That's why the murder scenes are all different," Laura realized. "They're creating different death scenarios to see how people react under different circumstances." "Exactly, and they're getting bolder." Rebecca Collins was their first living victim who survived. They wanted to study her journal, then observe her reactions directly as she faced death. The breakthrough in the case came from an unexpected source. The IT department, analyzing the metadata from the emails sent to Rebecca Collins, discovered something odd. Periodic connections from a public library computer that occurred at the exact same time each week, Wednesday afternoons between 2:15 and 3, 0 p.m. Today was Wednesday. It was 1:30 p.m. We assembled a team and positioned officers around the Millhaven Public Library, focusing on the computer terminals with the matching IP address. At precisely 2:17 p.m., a figure in a dark coat sat down at the terminal and began typing. The arrest was anticlimactic, no resistance, no dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet apprehension of the person who had orchestrated 5 deaths and 1 attempted murder while leaving virtually no trace of their identity, until now, as I placed the handcuffs on Dr. Burson-Huey. Thomas Reeves, head of pathology at Millhaven Memorial Hospital, he looked at me with an expression not of fear or anger, but of intellectual curiosity. "You're earlier than I expected, Detective Sherman," he said calmly. "I've been monitoring your investigation, of course. You made the connection through the library computers sooner than my models predicted. I stared at the man who had eluded us for nearly a year. In his mid-50s, with unremarkable features and wire-rimmed glasses, he could have passed for any professional on the street. Nothing about him suggested the calculated killer who had methodically ended 5 lives. Why? I asked simply. Research requires data, Detective, he replied, as if explaining something obvious. Academic theories like Montgomery's are interesting but fundamentally limited. To truly understand identity transformation, one must observe it directly at the most critical juncture of the moment when existence itself is threatened. His clinical detachment was more disturbing than any display of malice could have been. This was not a man driven by rage or trauma, but by a cold intellectual curiosity that had overridden all moral considerations. In the subsequent investigation, we discovered the full extent of Dr. Reeves' research. As a pathologist, he had access to all areas of the hospital, including psychiatric records, medication supplies, and staff schedules. His position had allowed him to identify potential victims who kept journals, gain access to their personal information, and study them long before making contact. He had meticulous files on each victim, including Rebecca Collins and 3 additional people he had been studying for future research subjects. Each file contained notes on their routines, relationships, and psychological profiles derived from their medical records and his own observations. He had been staging his elaborate evidence trail for years, slowly building connections that would lead investigators to Montgomery or Keating if his activities were ever discovered. But perhaps most disturbing was his journal, a detailed record of his findings about human identity under terminal threat. He had recorded his victims' final moments with clinical precision, noting their physiological responses, their emotional states, their final words or actions. Subject displayed remarkable clarity in final moments. He had written about Catherine Westmore. Identity cohered rather than fragmented under pressure, suggesting integrated sense of self despite contradictions noted in journal entries. And about Martin Drainer. Subject exhibited expected fear response initially, followed by unexpected shift to acceptance. Further research needed on relationship between anticipatory anxiety as documented in journal and terminal response, as we built our case against Dr. Plays. Reeves, I spent hours interviewing him, trying to understand the mind that could commit such calculated crimes. "You know what fascinates me about you, Detective?" He said during one such interview, his manner as casual as if we were discussing the weather. "Your sense of identity is so bound up in solving cases, in finding justice. I wonder how that identity would transform if faced with its own extinction." I felt a chill at the implicit threat, but maintained my composure. "Is that why you left clues? You wanted to be caught eventually?" He smiled slightly. "Every experiment must conclude with the publication of findings, Detective. My research would be meaningless if it remained private. I always intended for my work to be discovered just not before it was complete." "And was it complete?" I asked. "Or were there more victims planned?" His expression became contemplative. "Science is never truly complete, Detective. There are always more variables to explore, more data points to collect." He leaned forward slightly. "But I admit, Your intervention has provided an unexpected opportunity to study a different aspect of identity. How does the researcher's identity transform when their work is interrupted? When they become the subject of others' scrutiny? It's quite meta, don't you think? Dr. Thomas Reeves was eventually diagnosed with a rare form of psychopathy, characterized by extreme detachment and intellectual narcissism. He viewed other people not as individuals with rights and feelings, but as data points in his grand research project on identity. In his mind, he was conducting important work that justified any means necessary. He was found guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder, receiving consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. Dr. Plosses Enhouses. Montgomery was cleared of any direct involvement in the murders, though he faced professional censure for his unwitting role in the killer's methodology. As for me, the case left an indelible mark. The shadow collector had forced me to confront questions about identity that I had never considered: how we construct ourselves through our private thoughts, how we transform under pressure, and how vulnerable we all are to those who might see us merely as subjects to be studied rather than humans to be respected. Sometimes when I write in my own journal now, I find myself hesitating, wondering who might one day read these private thoughts. And then I remind myself that this self-censorship is precisely what monsters like Dr. Reeves would want. The corruption of our authentic selves through the fear of being watched. So I write anyway. Because in the end, our story is 7, the private ones, are what make us who we are. And no shadow collector can take that away unless we surrender it freely. Moral lesson and conclusion. The shadow collector case taught me many things. But perhaps the most profound lesson was about the nature of identity itself. We all contain multitudes, the selves we show to the world, the selves we show to those close to us, and the selves we reveal only in our most private moments. None of these selves is more authentic than the others. They are all fragments of who we truly are. Dr. at gse.r. Reeves believed he could capture the essence of a person by studying their private thoughts and their behavior in the face of death. But what he failed to understand, what his clinical detachment prevented him from seeing, was that identity isn't something that can be collected or possessed like a specimen in a jar. It's a living, breathing, constantly evolving thing that exists in the relationships we build, the choices we make, and the meaning we create from our experiences. In his twisted way, Reeves was asking a question that philosophers and psychologists have grappled with for centuries. Who are we, really? Are we defined by our private thoughts, our public actions, our relationships, or something else entirely? What I've come to believe, after 32 years of looking into the darkest corners of human behavior, is that we are defined not by any single aspect of ourselves, but by the integration of all these parts into a coherent whole. Our true identity emerges in the space between our private and public selves, in the constant negotiation between who we think we are and how we act in the world. And perhaps most importantly, our identity is revealed in our choice, especially the choices we make when faced with ethical dilemmas. Do we choose compassion over cruelty, connection over isolation, truth over deception? These choices, accumulated over a lifetime, create the core of who we are. If you take anything away from this story, let it be this: guard your privacy, but don't let fear prevent you from being authentically yourself. Be mindful of who you allow into your inner world, but don't close yourself off entirely. Because it's in those connections, those moments of genuine sharing, that we find both our individual identity and our shared humanity. And if you ever feel like someone is watching you too closely, studying you in ways that make you uncomfortable, trust that instinct. Martin Drainer sensed something was wrong long before he became a victim. His mistake wasn't in being paranoid, it was in not taking his own concerns seriously enough. Take care of each other. Pay attention. Look beyond the masks that people wear, but do so with compassion rather than calculation. Because in the end, What separated me from Dr. Reeves wasn't just moral values, it was the capacity to see people as whole beings worthy of dignity rather than subjects to be studied and discarded. I still carry the victims of the Shadow Collector with me, Catherine, Martin, and the others whose lives were cut short by someone who failed to see their humanity. Their stories remind me daily of the responsibility we all share to recognize and respect the sanctity of each person's journey, their right to define themselves on their own terms, and their fundamental worth beyond any use they might have to others. So I ask you, if you were faced with someone trying to reduce you to a subject of study, to collect the shadows of who you are without your consent, what would you do? How would you protect not just your physical safety, but the integrity of your identity? Think about that. Talk about it with those you trust. Share this story if you think it might help someone recognize the warning signs of being targeted by those who seek to violate boundaries of self. And remember that in a world where so much of our private lives is now digitized and potentially exposed, the greatest act of resistance may be continuing to be authentically yourself, complicated, contradictory, and gloriously human while remaining vigilant about who gets access to your innermost thoughts. If you found value in this journey through one of my most challenging cases, please subscribe to the Shernan channel and consider sharing this video with others who might benefit from these lessons. Your support helps me continue bringing these stories to light, hopefully preventing future crimes by increasing awareness and understanding. Until next time, this is Detective Marcus Shernan, reminding you that the greatest mysteries aren't always the ones we solve, but the ones we live with, the ongoing questions of who we are, who we might become, and how we navigate the shadows that exist within us all. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, your story is yours alone to write.